Welcome to the bonus show. The House, which is of course controlled by Republicans, has voted to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt for withholding Biden audio, refusing to turn over audio of President Biden's interview in the classified documents case. This is arguably the strongest rebuke of the Justice Department so far. It was a 216 to 207 vote, completely down party lines. And Republicans are essentially trying to coalesce a movement to argue that there are partisan hijinks at play at the Justice Department. And you know what? I understand why they're doing it, Pat. They're up against the wall because the argument that the Justice Department is operating as an arm of the Biden campaign is very much undercut by the recent conviction of Hunter Biden, by the prosecutions of Bob Menendez and Henry Cuellar, and so many of the other things that are going on. So it reeks of desperation. I don't think it really has any legs or teeth with regard to doing anything, but they're committed to this ideology.
No, it doesn't have any teeth on its own, but of course you could bring about a criminal referral to the Justice Department based on this finding by Congress. But that Justice Department is led by Merrick Garland, and it's easy to believe that he's not going to investigate whether charges should be brought against himself. And, he's claiming executive privilege. It makes total sense here. You talked about how this is a tit for tat. It seems to be in direct response to how Steve Bannon is going to be going to jail next month for his contempt of Congress. And Peter Navarro is currently serving in jail because of his contempt of Congress. And they, as their defense, cited executive privilege under the Trump administration for that, why they wouldn't cooperate with the January 6th committee. But of course, that falls apart completely because, for one, Trump never asserted executive privilege for them. And also, Joe Biden is the president now. He's the one who's able to determine whether these things fall under executive privilege. So Republicans are trying to act as if there's some sort of double standard, and people like Bannon and Navarro are being locked up while people like Garland are able to get away with contempt. But there's no double standard here. They're just lying about it.
Well, there is a double standard. It's not one they want to admit. And the double standard is they're okay with Trump deciding when executive privilege is appropriate, but not Biden. They're okay with Trump having total and complete immunity no matter what he did, when he did it, and whether it was related to his role as president. But they're not okay with Joe Biden having that same degree of immunity. There's very much a double standard, but it's they who are actually perpetrating it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the theme, right? It's always projection. It's always acting as if Democrats are doing these awful things, but it's actually they themselves who are doing it. And they're able to pull the wool over people's eyes because they just don't, explain in detail every element of the story. Like people who argue that Merrick Garland is getting some sort of special privilege here that Bannon and Navarro aren't getting. They'll leave out the detail entirely that Trump never exerted executive privilege. They'll leave out the detail that Biden is the one that controls these things now because he's currently the president. Yes. And then they'll act as if this double standard exists. So they perpetrate other ones for sure, but they claim ones that don't exist.
Now, all of this being said, I have to admit, I'd be curious to hear this audio because so much has been made of Joe Biden's supposed confusion and lack of memory during these interviews. We've seen transcripts, and while the transcript, I do think, is a very good and detailed transcript and does give us a very good sense of what it was like, one of the best ways that we as humans in society used to interacting with other humans have of evaluating someone's cognitive state is by, I think the recording gives you little details that the transcript doesn't. So like on a personal level, I'm kind of curious about this transcript, but I don't think there's anything invalid about what Merrick Garland is saying here.
Well, remember the transcript, or what we got of the transcript, debunked that whole point about how Biden couldn't remember when his son died. It seemingly did so. And, Biden was able to recall when that happened, even if he couldn't point to the exact month or year. I don't think that means that he's totally out of it or doesn't care about his family or whatever the case may be, whatever they try to argue.
In a literal sense, you're completely right, which is the rumor was the letter that was written about the testimony was Biden's memory is a problem. The transcript is released, and it does seemingly contradict that the memory is a problem. And some part of me thinks that the audio might put the whole thing to bed once and for all, but it also might not. It also might actually raise more questions or get Republicans saying, was the audio doctored or whatever the case may be.
Do you get the sense that Robert Hur made these statements about Biden's cognition to give some sort of a win to Republicans because he ultimately decided not to charge President Biden when it comes to this? And so he didn't want to maybe be seen as biased or giving this win to Democrats. He's a Republican after all himself. So in order to look as though he's neutral, he gave Republicans a bone, which is, I'm not going to charge President Biden, but I am going to say that he is mentally unfit, or at least
Right.
suggest that.
That would be a really horrible thing to do, especially if it's because he's trying to throw a bone. So listen, I'd like to hear the audio. I think it's appropriate that we not necessarily hear the audio, but we'll see whether this Merrick Garland contempt thing goes any further. North Dakota voters have passed a measure to impose age limits on congressional candidates. It's believed to be the first such measure in the country. It limits the ages on candidates seeking federal office. It will almost certainly be challenged in court. And the argument here is that they want to establish a constitutional amendment imposing age restrictions. It would ban people from running for House or Senate seats in North Dakota if they could be 81 by December 31st of the year preceding the end of the term. So I guess that would be like, if your term ends in January of next year, you have to be you can't be older than 80 years and 364 days old on December 31st of the week before, essentially, is what it is. It's a little bit of a convoluted way of saying it. It's basically an 81-year-old age limit. 61% of voters approved it, 39% opposed it. What do you think, Pat?
I'm a little bit torn. I've said in the past that I'm not in support of these maximum age limits when it comes to serving in an elected capacity. I would much prefer to see term limits because I think you de facto solve this issue of representatives being too old when you have term limits. Because what often happens is people come into power when they're, let's say, 50 years old, and they stay there and they get reelected and reelected, and then they're still serving by the time they're 80 or 90. Rarely do you have someone who comes up while they're 75 years old, for example, and then serves a couple of terms. So I think the better approach here is term limits, and then you don't have to worry about age discrimination, ageism, that sort of thing. But at the same time, if we're not going to have that, if that's not an option on the table, if that's not the question being asked of North Dakota voters, would I be willing to go along with something like this, knowing it achieves some of what I want, but not all of it, knowing there may not be another opportunity to pass something like term limits in the near future? I would be a little bit torn, but I think ultimately I would vote yes on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in the sense that I would prefer to approach this from a term limit strategy than an age strategy. And I actually think the bigger, we've seen examples of people where it seemed like the problem was age. The bigger problem is the kind of recalcitrance that develops when you have the same people in power for longer periods of time. So if you said to me, David, you get one or the other, you get either term limits or age limits, I'm going with the term limits. Would I be in favor of an arbitrary 81 year of age limit? Honestly, I don't know. I mean, this would kick out. How old is Bernie now? Wouldn't this effectively remove Bernie from the Senate?
Yeah, I think he's in his early 80s. It effectively would do that. And, what often happens too is when you have these elder members of Congress or any elected position, maybe they start to slip. Maybe there's clearly signs of aging, but because they've served in that capacity for so long, people get a sense of who they are, and they feel as like, oh, well, I really know who this person is at heart. So maybe their brain is malfunctioning here or there. They have a senior moment, whatever the case may be, but we've known this person for years and years. And so we're okay with keeping them on as our elected representative. Now, I'm not saying that's a good argument necessarily, but that seems to be what happens. Whereas if you had someone who wasn't serving for all those years and decades, and they just came up while they were 75 years old or so, and they start slipping, I think voters wouldn't have that built-in sense of, oh, well, we know this person. We know we know who they are at heart. We don't have to worry about these things. And there would be more of a push to get them out in the next election.
I tend to agree with that perspective. I actually don't think this is going to stand. It's not. I've read conflicting legal opinions. I think there's a good case to be made that this is not going to stand legally. But at this point, all we can do is wait and see. Let's talk about the Florida Senate race. If you had asked me 6 months ago, do I think that the Florida Senate race, the seat that Republican Senator Rick Scott is trying to hold on to, do I believe that it is in play for Democrats? I would have said probably not. Old friend of the show, who was on the show when she was a member of Congress, Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, is now challenging Rick Scott for that seat. Initially, the polling was quite disparate. It wasn't obvious that she was going to have a shot. At one point, she was losing by 17 points. This race, according to a poll from Florida Atlantic University, is now a statistical tie. It is within the margin of error, with Scott at 45 and Powell at 43. Of course, that's only 88% of voters. There's another 12% of the electorate that is unsure or third party or something else. So this is sort of like situations we've seen in Texas previously, Pat, where conventional wisdom tells us this is probably not winnable for Mucarsel-Powell. But I think Florida is different than Texas. And this is already many months out from the race. I think there's reason for cautious optimism, and it would be such a big deal to knock out Rick Scott that I do think this is a race worthy of putting some time and resources into.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, over the past few years, so many Democrats have essentially given up on Florida. It's easy to forget that actually in 2020, it was considered a swing state, and Trump did win the state, but only by about 3 points, 51% to Biden's 48%. So it was relatively close. And of course, we've had population shifts since then because of COVID, and Ron DeSantis did win by a 19-point margin in the 2022 midterms. So it is clearly in Republican hands, but that doesn't mean that we can't take it back from them. Even if we don't do it this election cycle, I think that there is hope for the future. So I'm not ready to give up on Florida. And we shouldn't give up on Florida, too, because they have so many electoral college votes, right? 29 or something like that. So, if we're able to keep that competitive and if we have this long shot chance at winning there, we should pursue that because that could be a game ender if we're able to pick that one up.
I do think that we want to be honest about the polling. And while the polling with Mucarsel-Powell and Scott looks very interesting, it increasingly does seem like Florida is completely out of reach for Joe Biden in November. Now, the great news for Biden is he doesn't need it. He didn't need it in 2020. And if Biden just gets the states he got in 2020, he wins. But among likely voters, new polling has Trump ahead by 6 in Florida, which is outside of the margin of error. And it has him polling 49. 49 could mean 46 or 52 based on the margin of error. And so, listen, you never give up on anything. And Florida is such a huge state. You're still going to get out the vote. But if I'm realistic, it's not really seeming like Florida's in play for Biden this time around.
Probably not, but there is a long shot chance, especially with Mucarsel-Powell doing quite well in this poll. There's a chance that maybe she wins the Senate race despite Biden losing. It could happen, or it could, just motivate people to go out in the polls if they really like her and they would vote up ticket potentially and also vote for Biden. So there's the possibility of that. And we also know that the abortion question is going to be on the ballot in Florida this year. So that could also mobilize Democratic turnout. Even people who believe that Biden doesn't have a shot at winning could come out to vote for the abortion issue, and maybe we'd surprise people there. So I don't think it's completely out of reach. And that would be quite a statement if Rick Scott is kicked out of the Senate, unable to win re-election. I'd love to see it.
The other interesting Florida thing from this very same polling is about the governor's race for 2026. You might remember that DeSantis was reelected in 2020, right? Yeah, I believe it's 6-year terms. 2022. Oh, right. Yep. Oh, that was more recent. In 22.
In Florida, you can only serve back-to-back terms, and you have to get out for at least a term before you can come back. So
the idea that's being floated is for Casey DeSantis to run in 2026. And even though nobody has said anything about her being interested, and she has actually said she is not interested, a lot of Florida Republicans like the idea. And pollsters asked Republicans, who would you support for governor if the election were held today? Again, bearing in mind what Pat said, that DeSantis can't run again without being off for a term. And 43%, by far a plurality, said Casey DeSantis. I have to tell you, Pat, I think if she ran, I think she could win in Florida.
Well, we have yet another example of a first lady saying that she's not interested in the job.
Yes.
I don't think Democrats will cling on to this idea that she's definitely going to run like Republicans do with Michelle Obama, who has repeatedly said over the years that she's not going to do it.
She's not running, yeah. Do you think that, as far as the Michelle thing, we talked about it on the podcast, is there any scenario where Vivek's claim that she may just be forced to replace Biden? Is there any world in which that happens between now and November?
I don't even understand entirely what he means by that. Like, forced, does that mean that she's pressured by whatever he says, the deep state made up of Susan Rice and other figures we can't mention by name? And, or does it suggest that she actually doesn't have a choice? Like she would be blackmailed or something like that and actually coerced into doing something like that. I don't exactly know what the claim is. Is she
I
just
don't
being
know.
strongly advised to do something? Is she actually being like pressured forcefully? Like, what is even the claim they're trying to make?
I think it's some version of she will be the subject of intense pressure and will bow to the pressure to some in some way, shape, or form.
It's like what does this conspiracy theory even serve? Like what is even the point of coming up with something like this? I understand this idea of putting out there, okay, Biden isn't capable of running for president again. He's not capable of serving anymore, so they're going to replace him with someone. But why does that someone have to be Michelle Obama? Wouldn't it be someone like a Gavin Newsom who we know
Right.
has aspirations for higher office and may run for president one day? Why don't you go with him instead of Michelle, who said over and over again she's not going to do it? Maybe just they fear her that much. They realize that she could win if she was interested in the job.
It seems way more logical to me that they're focused on her either because they're afraid, or as I said on the podcast, she fills some kind of demographic or identity role that is interesting to Republicans based on what they want to project about the Democratic Party. Again, if I'm a betting man, I don't think Michelle Obama gets anywhere near the nomination. So we will follow all of it, and I will see you back here tomorrow for the Friday show.